maybe we can cut the money, maybe we can raise it a little. It's just a little game that's been going on now for 40, 50 years. And we're left with an unsatisfactory system. It's not very well organized. Everybody's sort of off in their own world. So PEG access people are over here, and the public radio people are over here, and the public TV people are somewhere way else over there. You know, there are also some rays of hope. But I want to just, at this point, maybe give it back. I'll also mention Gingrich and Dole specifically tried to attack the funding in the 90s. But I'll give it back to Steve a little bit here to talk about the 96 Act.
Right, all right. So the kind of low point, the nadir point in the history of the public's access or influence over the airwaves really has to be the whole ugly process by which the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was passed. Now, when then President Bill Clinton signed this into law, he proclaimed that by affixing his signature to the bill, that he was initiating the age of the information superhighway. So he was officially opening up the information superhighway, and we were promised that as a direct result of this bill, the American public was going to have, access to more media than ever before, and that the media that we were going to have access to was going to be more democratic than ever before. But if you actually take a look at what this legislation did, it tells a very different story. In the lead up to in the writing of the Telecom Act of 1996, big telecommunications companies, big broadcasting companies spent literally millions upon millions of dollars lobbying key committee members in Congress. And basically, we now know for example, Patricia Aufderheide wrote a whole book about the passage of the Telecom Act of 1996. We now know that whole portions of that act were written by corporate lobbyists, essentially written by corporate lobbyists. And they got basically everything they wanted. And this idea that the media, that our broadcasting system should serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity was just very quietly brushed aside. What did the Telecom Act of 1996 ultimately do? Well, one thing that it did was, let me just say that the basic philosophy underwriting this act was that thanks to the rise of cable television and the internet and other forms of so-called new media, the communication industries were much more competitive in the 1990s than they were in the 1930s, when the Communication Act of 1934 was written. So the theory was we should allow all of these industries to simply compete with each other. And that meant doing away with all of the regulations that had been put in place that were designed to protect the public interest or to protect against the growth of monopoly, et cetera, et cetera. One of the major provisions of the Act put an end entirely to the cap on ownership of radio stations nationwide. So it made it theoretically possible for a single company to own every radio station in the country, theoretically. It also raised the limit on the number of radio stations any one company could own in a given market, that is to say, in a given metropolitan region, from what had originally been 4 to 8, basically doubling overnight the number of radio stations a company could own in a market like the size of Chicago. It increased the limits on the size of the audience that television networks could reach. And one of the sort of, well, at the time wasn't talked about, but one of I think the most important provisions of the Act was it mandated periodic review of all other regulations affecting media ownership, so that the FCC every 4 years would have to then revisit every regulation governing media ownership on their books and to decide whether or not it was still justified. And so periodically, the FCC, by law, has to decide whether, for example, the ban on cross-ownership of newspapers and broadcast outlets is justified, or whether they can do away with it. And essentially, written into the act is this sort of presumption that that government governs best, which governs least. That we should let the free market prevail at all costs, even if it means allowing for the growth of monopoly in particular industries. Because now they're claiming, or the authors of the act claim, because all of these different media of communication are competing with each other. The final thing that it did, and something that Scott is going to talk more to, is it mandated a transition from analog television broadcasting to digital television broadcasting. And the way that it did it, as Robert alluded to at the beginning, basically amounted to, by a conservative estimate, $90 billion giveaway to the incumbent licensees, that is, to the existing television station. Because they were given, as Robert said at the beginning, essentially spectrum that could accommodate 10 new digital television channels for nothing, for free, without having to pay a single cent. It was a huge corporate giveaway. Scott's going to talk more about it, though.
Yes. Yeah, the $90 billion estimate, I believe that's actually from Noam Chomsky. I went with that because it's the highest number, and it sounded good to me. And we could grab even a portion of $90 billion somehow or other for a public media system that works. That might be a good goal. Yeah, it's 10 stations. Now those 10 stations, of course, that they get in place of the one that they used to have that they had to give back. We gave them the one, and then they gave that back. And then we gave them 10, which would be roughly a similar quality, almost as good as an old regular analog broadcast. Of course, they could take that same amount of space and make one really nice, very high definition signal out if they wanted to as well. Yeah, a factor of 10. It's interesting that it's 1 for 10 because that's also the same ratio of female and minority ownership of television stations compared to the general population. When you do the math, it turns out that the women and minorities should be owning roughly 10 times the number of stations that they currently own. So the big broadcasters were given 10 times as many frequencies, and the women and minorities have 1/10 of what they deserve. So this is all some kind of higher math that should be upsetting to just about anybody. Now, to bring things even more forward, and again, it's great to have this history that Steve brought up because you can sort of see how things get repeated when we don't learn. One thing Steve and I were sort of laughing about just before we started this was one of the first important legal cases in the United States involving advertising was this doctor who was quack. He was selling, what was it, goat glands?
He was Scott's talking about this case of Dr. John Brinkley, one of the first. He actually owned a radio station called, what is it? Kansas folks know best, KFKB,
Yeah.
Run out of Kansas, and he was basically a Latter-day medicine man who was saying that he could cure men of their impotence by implanting goat glands in their testicles. And he was actually the first person ever to have his license taken away by the it was actually by the FRC, but before the FCC. He was the first person to have his license taken away. And he actually moved to Mexico and continued broadcasting into the United States from Mexico, from across the border.
And that precedent actually was used in part when the case was made to try to force the broadcasters to stop advertising cigarettes, because there was this history that this health issue was sort of an exception, and we had to draw the line somewhere. So they actually, coerced basically the tobacco companies to stop broadcasting commercials.